Support for the Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you in part by University of Idaho, Idaho's only Carnegie R1 classified research university. Our Carnegie R1 designation recognizes the discoveries we make that help our forests thrive. It means we're creating more doctors and doing real research to strengthen cybersecurity for Idaho businesses, our energy sector, and every Idahoan. More at go.uidaho.edu/Idaho-is-Idaho.
Hundreds of bills move through the Idaho legislature each session, and it can be hard to keep track of what's really at stake. The Connector follows the legislation that's gaining traction with clear reporting and local context you can trust. Stay connected to the State House with The Connector, Idaho Daily News. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you updated on the news that made headlines this last week and today. Our panel includes Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Sarah Cutler, reporter with Idaho Statesman, and Max Silverson, editor of the Star News. Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to the show.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Hi there.
Hi, Gemma.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Clark, let's start off with you. Idaho's Attorney General says new state budget cuts could mean unpaid furloughs or layoffs for employees in his office. But he's now apparently asking lawmakers to reconsider before these reductions actually start. So what specifically drove lawmakers to include the AG's office in these budget cuts if it was initially expected to be exempt, if I'm remembering correctly?
Yeah. Hey, Gemma, that's a great question. And after watching the first 47 days of this year's legislative session, I'm inclined to say it's because they don't know what they're doing, right? But I think what happened is I think it was a miscommunication and a little bit of a misunderstanding. And I think part of it also has to do with the fact that all of the people on JFAC today, which is the Idaho Legislature's powerful budget committee, all of the people today on JFAC do not have experience cutting budgets. They weren't here during the Great Recession, 2008 to 2011, which is essentially the last time that the state of Idaho went through these significant budget reductions. But it's a little bit of a kind of a separation of different branches of government type issue is what we're running into. The basic context is the legislature is looking at cutting budgets for most state agencies and most departments this year, as we know, to avoid a revenue shortfall and to make way to pass and fully implement these tax changes that President Trump supported in the One Big Beautiful Bill. So most all state agencies and departments are having to face budget cuts for the current year that we're in and for next year, as you know, and as we've talked about before on the show. But because the Attorney General is a separate elected position, the governor did not include the Attorney General's office in the first round of cuts. Those might be referred to as the 3% cuts, if that sounds familiar. Governor Little didn't include those for the Attorney General in the first round of cuts because the Attorney General is a separate elected position, totally separate from the governor's office. And so Attorney General Raul Labrador said he didn't expect to receive a cut. But then when JFAC was cutting budgets earlier this month, not only did JFAC give the Attorney General's office the 3% cut, but they tacked on an additional 1% for the current budget year and an additional 2% for the next budget year, bringing it to 5%. And the Attorney General, General Labrador, came to JFAC this week. He said, I wasn't planning on those cuts. I thought I was exempted. We're super late into the fiscal year, and personnel costs are a huge driver in my budget. And so if I do have to have these cuts, it's going to mean furloughs for everyone in the Attorney General's office, 11 furlough days between now and the end of June, and then another 14 furlough days next year, almost 3 full weeks of unpaid time. And so Attorney General asked the legislature to restore those cuts. That hasn't happened yet. The budget is still coming together even today as we speak. The budget is still coming together. And so we don't know if the legislature is going to restore those cuts or leave those cuts in place. But I think it kind of speaks to the uncertainty, the confusion, the chaos, the misunderstanding of what's going on with the budget, who is affected by the cuts, what do the cuts actually mean to the public. I think there's a considerable amount of confusion, anxiety, uncertainty, and some legislators and members of the public are having a hard time understanding exactly what's being cut and how it's being done. So I think this one issue is related to the overall sort of chaos and fog that's playing out right now with these giant budget cuts that the legislature is implementing due to 5 years worth of tax cuts and this desire to fully implement President Trump's federal tax changes. I think that's some of what's going on, but we don't have all the answers for sure, Gemma.
So, Clark, so what happens next procedurally? And what I mean by this is, how likely is it that lawmakers will actually restore any of this requested funding? And I'm also curious, you talked about furloughs in the AG's office. Has this come up for any other state agencies who not only they had this 3% cut, but now are looking potentially at another 1% to 2% cut? And so, I mean, could furloughs be on the horizon for other state department agencies?
Yeah, furloughs, I think, could be on the horizon for other state agencies and departments. The Idaho State Police and Idaho Department of Correction were initially very, very concerned that they would have to implement furloughs, but then the legislature exempted them from the latest round of across-the-board cuts to avoid some of that damage. Procedurally, in terms of what will happen next, I expect a big fight, and I mean like a debate fight, to break out in the legislature next week or the week after about what we do with these budgets. These budgets still all need to go to the full Idaho House of Representatives and Idaho Senate for votes. That has not happened yet, and so I expect the full legislature will weigh in on these cuts, and I expect a big debate and fight and lots of disagreements. I think it's an open question of whether they will restore any of these cuts. I know all of the reporters on the program the last couple of weeks have talked about what the cuts would do to the state. We've cited state agencies and directors by name on the record saying these cuts would cut into core services and do deep harm to the state of Idaho for years to come. One senator, State Senator Kevin Cook of Idaho Falls, said we are about to pass something that has the potential to break the state, and you all know that. And so I think it's an open question of whether any of the cuts will be restored. We saw resistance last Friday and again early this morning to restoring very small amounts of funding to provide scholarships for members of the Idaho National Guard. Two weeks in a row, efforts to restore that funding was rejected. And so it may speak, Gemma, to some of the difficulties in restoring some of these cuts that the Budget Committee implemented in the first part of February.
All right. Thanks for that, Clark. Sarah, Donald Trump Jr. made a brief but pretty high-profile stop in Boise earlier this week. I mean, he drew a packed crowd, but he also drew protesters outside of the events. But it also is raising some new questions in regards to things like politics and cryptocurrency, but even the growing influence of a Republican political group here in Idaho. So, Sarah, can you start with this? What was the bigger goal of his visit? A political appearance, a policy discussion about cryptocurrency, or strengthening relationship with Idaho Republicans? I mean, maybe it was all three.
Great question. I was going to say, I don't think we know. That was sort of my question. I can say, Donald Trump Jr. was only in Boise for one day, and he spoke in the evening at that larger event you mentioned that had about 600 people in attendance. That was a political event, hundreds of people on a panel with Governor Brad Little. But earlier in the day also spoke at a smaller private event for lawmakers and lobbyists focused on an Idaho bill that involves cryptocurrency, with which he actually Trump Jr. has a connection. So the sponsor of that bill told me that he wasn't personally involved in bringing Trump to Idaho, but I don't think we totally have a clear-cut picture of the chicken or egg here, which speaking engagement or goal came first.
Well, and part of that, Sarah, could be that media outlets were not allowed inside this event. So, I mean, how does that potentially impact what the public knows about what was actually said in those events?
Sure. And, It certainly affects what we know about what was said. I spoke with the organizer of that larger evening event the day after, and he was fairly open with me about the gist of the conversation. It sounded like a pretty high level conversation about Idaho's role in national politics, things like that. But we don't have a detailed insight into that because media weren't permitted. And to be clear, it was a private event that people could buy tickets to, so it wasn't that people couldn't get in if they wanted to pay for a ticket, but I had specifically spoken with the organizers about whether media could be there and cover the event and was told no, I was not given a reason as to why. But it certainly, limits what we can say about the details there.
Okay, so even though we don't know a lot about the event, do we know anything about what the event did in terms of the role and some could argue really a rising influence of the Idaho Majority Club within our state's Republican political landscape?
So to me, this was actually one of the most interesting dynamics, I guess, around the event. The group that organized that larger evening event, as you mentioned, is called the Idaho Majority Club. It's a political action committee that's about 2, 3 years old, and it's an offshoot of the state Republican Party, but it's not the same as the party. And their rise kind of came out of some Republican Party infighting that we've seen that very much continues. I'd say disagreement, not so much over ideology, but over tactics and approach, how maybe hardline the party wants to be, or, demanding of, for example, what I believe members of this political action committee have called purity tests. Um, so this new group has said it wants to, kind of go back to what they see as the original dynamics or previous dynamics of the Republican Party. So this event, I would say, was kind of a coup for them to get a member of the Trump family, not to mention other senior leaders like Governor Little, to be at their event rather than something coming through the formal state party. And, the event's organizer did tell me, of course, anyone's welcome to attend, buy a ticket, but I think it was a priority for them to make clear that this was their event, separate from the state parties.
All right, appreciate that update, Sarah. Clark, Idaho lawmakers have approved millions of dollars in new funding for the State Tax Commission to implement recent federal tax changes. And you touched on this briefly in the last segment, but there are still questions emerging about why those costs weren't disclosed earlier in the legislative process. So why weren't the implementation costs included in the bill's fiscal note, despite warnings from the Tax Commission about transparency?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Gemma, and we haven't been able to get a good answer, unfortunately, at the Idaho Capitol Sun as to why they were left out. But you're absolutely right. We've been talking about budget cuts and then restoring some of the cuts, and you're absolutely right. One of the most prominent cuts that has been restored so far is funding for the Idaho State Tax Commission to implement and conform to those federal tax cuts that President Trump championed in the federal One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's kind of the legislature's top priority this year. It was the first bill passed and signed into law. It has a huge impact on the budget because not only is Idaho fully conforming with it, but we are conforming retroactively to those tax changes. And so the actual expense, though, for the tax commission to do that through hiring additional seasonal tax employees and hiring and purchasing sort of tax processing software, those costs were not included in the original bill to comply with the tax cuts. As you said, there's been a big push in this year of budget uncertainty of having accurate budget statements, accurate fiscal notes attached to bills. But that didn't happen in this case, and so funding was added back in after the fact. As in terms of why funding was added back in for the tax commission and the tax cuts and not for other programs, at least as of yet, is I would say it comes down to the top priority for Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Moyle, Republicans in the legislature, and Republican Governor Brad Little to seem like they are fully supporting and championing the federal tax package from President Trump. I think that's the why of why it was so easy to restore this funding, even though it's a much larger pool of money. I think we're talking about more than $2 million for fiscal year 27, plus another nearly $1 million for the current year. So it's a much larger pot of money that was restored fairly easily compared to, say, the fight that I talked about, where now 2 weeks in a row, the Budget Committee has rejected efforts to restore a much, much smaller amount of funding for scholarships and tuition assistance for members of the Idaho National Guard. So I think it comes down to priorities.
So Clark, I was just going to ask you that. You said the National Guard. So how did lawmakers justify approving this increase shortly after they rejected this smaller proposal that was tied to the National Guard tuition assistance?
Yeah, and so one of the things that came out with the tax cuts for the tax commission specifically, that's funny to talk about tax cuts or budget cuts for the tax commission, but one of the things that came out is without this money, the tax commission was going to have a very difficult time implementing all of these changes, given that people are already filing their taxes and have been since January, right? Tax season is upon us. Thousands of people have already filed. People are filing every day. And so word came out from the tax commission that there could be delays of up to a few months in processing tax returns, which could lead to penalties and additional interest costs for the state of Idaho. And so once that news began circulating that tax refunds could be delayed much, much longer than usual, and that there could be a cost to that state, that's when legislators got serious about approving the additional funding enhancements for the tax commission. And it kind of lines up with the timing of the election, right? We've got a primary election coming up in May, and I think they're trying to avoid a situation where thousands of Idahoans are waiting and waiting and waiting for tax refunds that they are owed and due at a time when legislators are running for re-election. I don't think we can overlook the timing and the election aspect of it.
So, Clark, is the regular Idahoan going to see any differences, during tax filing or collections?
It all depends. They certainly could, and it may depend on what your tax status filing is, how old you are, what type of work that you are in. Some of the tax changes from President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill include things like no tax on tips for workers, an expanded deduction for senior citizens, no tax on interest on car loans, no tax on overtime pay. So for workers in the service industry, workers who are paid hourly and have overtime, or for senior citizens, yes, they will expect a tax reduction or perhaps a larger tax refund, but it all depends on the individual circumstances. And some people, to be taking advantage of the no tax on tips, may have needed to be calculating their tips last year before they knew this change was even coming. And so I think there are some questions about how it will all shake out in particularly in this first year, particularly for the thousands of people who have already filed their taxes. But yes, the idea is that people being paid hourly, people in the service industry who rely on tips, and senior citizens and people who have car loans would experience a tax benefit as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill. That's the idea, Gemma.
Okay. So, Max, McCall City leaders are planning tighter security measures for this summer's 4th of July celebration. And they're hoping, they're going to put fences up, they're going to have private security guards that will hopefully curb a big problem that McCall City leaders have been seeing, and this is underage drinking. And they do want to keep this big, huge, popular holiday weekend family friendly. So, Max, what specifically prompted the city to add these new security measures? I mean, was there a particular incident or trend that has changed the city's approach?
Hi, gentlemen. Yeah, there wasn't really a specific incident. This is definitely a response to a greater trend. And to put that in perspective, it's kind of helpful to look at the history of the 4th of July in McCall. The celebration developed a bit of a reputation for being kind of an out-of-control party back in the day. And so in 2016, the city and the county both adopted an alcohol ban in public parks during the 4th of July weekend. And that ban has continued forward since then. But, after several years of improvements and kind of moving that party atmosphere to more of a family-friendly event, underage drinking violations have kind of risen to the top of the police reports. And when I talk about these changes that they're proposing too, I should also kind of clarify like what they mean by security and by fences. Like the fences are, those kind of short aluminum barricades that link
Mm-hmm.
together. They're not meant as like a to fence in a crowd. They'd be in place kind of more to direct people to access points. So when they walk in, they see these signs that say no drinking, it's against the law, that type of thing. And the security guards kind of like they're similar to an event staff at a concert. Like they're proposing
Mm.
5 to 15 people that would be brought in. Like they're not bouncers, they're not armed, they're not going to tackle anyone, I don't think. And the chief of police kind of put it in perspective too. The company they're considering for the contract, which is based in Star, was under consideration because, as he said, like they know when to assist and kind of when to call the police. Like it's a job that volunteers have done in the past, and this is kind of just an effort to, I think, make it a little more professional, a little more
Mm-hmm.
organized, and with a direct line to the police if needed.
So, Max,
Yeah.
have you heard from residents or local businesses? I mean, how are they feeling about the idea of increased security at this event?
Right. We haven't really taken a statistically relevant poll yet. We don't have a full picture of how people feel about it, but the initial reactions I've heard have been pretty positive. One reason is just kind of why this, the reason for this. Like people who live
Mm-hmm.
downtown and work downtown have not been thrilled with the big party of the past. It was a little bit much.
So, Max, if the plan works as the city is hoping it does, have city officials said if they would continue these measures moving forward? I mean, just it becoming a permanent part of the 4th of July celebrations up in McCall?
It was kind of framed as a see how it goes type of thing. If it goes well this year, I think they would probably consider it. There are some costs to it too. It's not a free edition. I think the
Mm-hmm.
price they cited was $35,000 for the fences and the staff for that year. Which once you own the fences, then you don't buy those again. But it's the type of thing that they would have to look at each year. They're seeking sponsors to try and offset that cost. And whether or not it comes back, they will, be considering it, I think, around this time of year, well in advance of the holiday. So we'll see.
So, would it still continue to be an open public event, even with
Oh,
these
yes,
measures
of
in
course. I
place?
hope that was clear in my reporting. Yeah,
Yeah.
the 4th of July, they call it the Lakeside Liberty Festival in McCall, would still be open to the public. People are free to walk in and out as they please. I mean, the fences and the security are just kind of there to, show people where to go. There's no gate you need to get through or anything, super
Mm-hmm.
restrictive.
So, Sarah, Idaho lawmakers are advancing new legislation that's aimed at protecting religious services from disruptions. And this is following national incidents that raised some local concerns about safety at houses of worship. So, what kinds of incidents or concerns are Idaho church leaders actually reporting that prompted lawmakers to pursue these bills right now?
Yeah, so I heard from the two lawmakers that are pushing complementary legislation, as they called it, on this issue, that it was actually a January protest at a church in Minneapolis, a protest against ICE. At that church, the pastor also works for ICE. I heard that that protest and some of the social media videos that came out of it were really the impetus for this legislation. They did not like the look of protesters interrupting a church service and wanted to prevent something like that here. To your question, is that happening here in Idaho, though? I would say it's unclear. Both told me that they were hearing of similar incidents in the state, but they didn't provide specifics. Senator Kelly Anthony, one of the sponsors, told me he's not aware of anyone specifically tracking these kinds of incidents in Idaho, but he did note that there are some nationwide studies seeing, harassment or protests or attacks at houses of worship nationwide. I get a sense that increasingly in recent years, we've seen Idaho churches and houses of worship, I would say, beefing up security teams, looking at a wide range of
Mm-hmm.
threats. And I think some of those folks may be looking at the national political scene as well and just thinking through possible scenarios that could come up.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say anecdotally, Sarah. I mean, in my own church, they've put a security a team in place. Just recently, so we are seeing more of that. But I'm curious about how these proposals would change existing laws around protest or trespassing or disturbing the peace here in Idaho, since we already have laws like that on the books.
Yeah, so these bills are taking two separate approaches toward the same goal. Again, the sponsors told me that these are complementary, not competing bills. So Representative Bruce Skog from Nampa has sponsored a bill that basically refines the definition of disturbing the peace. That's something that, as you note, is already a misdemeanor in Idaho. But the definition would specifically include houses of worship as a place where that's not allowed. And then Senator Kelly Anthon, the other sponsor, is working to add a specific criminal trespassing offense for entering church premises when you're not allowed. So in both cases, they're kind of refining or expanding existing crimes, I guess you could say.
So, Sarah, have civil liberties groups or faith organizations raised concerns about how these measures could impact lawful protest or free speech?
I haven't heard that directly from those groups. I will say Senator James Rookde in committee voiced the idea that Senator Anthon's bill actually did a really good job of balancing those competing needs. On the House floor, Representative Ilana Rubel actually, on the other hand, raised a concern that Representative Skogg's bill, that's the one about disturbing the peace, that it included religious gatherings and not just houses of worship, and she felt that that was troublingly vague. Because how do you define a religious gathering? And she gave the example of, a lot of protests in Idaho might involve clergy being present. So would that count as a religious gathering where you can't disturb the peace? So I think some of those questions are raising concerns, but I haven't heard that directly from advocacy groups.
So, Clark, big election coming up in November, and we have, I believe, every state race that's coming up. I mean, every lawmaker is up for re-election, and we just found out that Idaho Governor Brad Little has officially entered the race. He's looking to win a third term, and this could set up to be a pretty crowded 2026 gubernatorial contest. So, talk to us about what advantages or maybe challenges does the governor face because he's the incumbent and he's heading into a primary with multiple Republican challengers.
Yeah, for sure. Jim, I think the big advantage that he brings into the race is name recognition. Brad Little probably has among the strongest name recognition of any statewide elected official in Idaho, and that's because he's been doing it so long. He's been governor for 8 years now, almost. He was lieutenant governor for 10 years before that, and he was in the Idaho Senate before that. He comes from a prominent ranching family, and his own father was a state senator. So Brad Little's been serving in public office in Idaho for 25 years now. And so he has a lot of name recognition. I would say that is the thing that he brings with him into the race that sets him aside from every other candidate that we've seen file to this point. It is worth noting we're talking here Friday over the lunch hour, and the filing period is still open until 5 o'clock Mountain Time today. So we still have a little over 5 hours left to see if there's any other candidates. But it is shaping up to be a little bit of a crowded field. But you're right, 2026 is an important election across the country. It's the midterms, and it's an important election here in Idaho. As you mentioned, Gemma, all statewide elected offices. So we're talking about the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, treasurer, and controller. Those are all up for election this year. And then all 105 seats in the Idaho legislature are also up for election this year. And the big dates to keep in mind is the first election that we have to get to is the May 19th primary election. Because of the supermajority in Idaho, the Republican primary takes on outsized importance in the state of Idaho, but the primary election is May 19th, and the general election is November 3rd. So a big election across the country and a big election for everyone in Idaho. I think the challenges that Governor Little and really any incumbent could face this year have to do with the budget. We are right now, as we're in the middle of our filing period, we're going through and we're debating these budget cuts. We've had state directors and officials talk about the damage that the cuts could do, things like hiring fewer firefighters and doing less wildfire prevention, heading into the fire season with no money in the bank to prepay for wildfire, risking some of the crisis support services that the health and welfare programs provide, cutting back on water quality testing for things like harmful algae blooms, cutting back on treatment courts that have reduced crime and have led to thousands of Idahoans turning their lives around. Kind of the list goes on and on and on about all of the programs and agencies that are touched by the 4% cuts in the current year and the 5% cuts next year, which will be permanent, ongoing. And so I think the baggage of the last 4 years, the baggage of the budget would be some of the challenges that Governor Little or any incumbent would bring with them running for reelection at a time when everyone says Idaho is not in a recession. Everyone says Idaho's economy is doing well, yet we are doing significant mid-year budget holdbacks that is disrupting programs and services that thousands of people rely on. So there's this chaotic element of our government that's transpiring right as we're heading into campaign season. And so that could be a challenge for any incumbent, Gemma.
So, Clark, I had Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke on the program on Tuesday, and I asked him, if these budget cuts truly start impacting Idahoans, right, where they can feel these budget cuts. You mentioned wildfire season, right? That could have a huge impact on people, right? And I asked him, so if this were to happen, who should people hold responsible? And he said very succinctly, the legislature. Yeah. So I'm curious. That could, and we're talking every state official, we're talking every legislator is on the ballot for reelection. When you have one of our most high profile political figures saying you can hold the legislature accountable, that's kind of got to be they've got a lot to answer to after the legislative session. Could that be a challenge for these folks who are seeking reelection?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The lieutenant governor, as you mentioned, lieutenant governor has been speaking out increasingly about the budget situation. And Lieutenant Governor Bedke, quite frankly, is very familiar with the budget. He is now he's the lieutenant governor, but he was the longest serving Speaker of the House in Idaho history. And he was also a member of the Budget Committee. So he's pretty well versed on these matters. And for him to blame the legislature and let's not beat around the bush. He is blaming Republicans who control the legislature, members of his own party, for saying they were not setting the budget responsibly. He's made comments to the effect that the state of Idaho acted like Congress. He did not mean that as a compliment. He meant they were spending money that they did not have. And so I think it could be a challenge, particularly as more information comes to light about the legislators who are voting against things like restoring funding for military scholarships, who have not yet acted to increase funding for firefighting activities this season. I think all of that is coming to play as we head into campaign season. And there is a scenario, Gemma, where this all falls apart right before the primary election because of the way our fiscal year is set up that ends in June 30th. So we're actually coming to the very end of our fiscal year. We're not at the beginning of it, even though we're in the month of February. So that's a little bit confusing. But yeah, all of this unpredictable, chaotic elements with the budget are playing out right now as we head into campaign season. And I can tell you there is a considerable amount of tension in the state capitol right now as we are weighing these budget cuts and the impact of these budget cuts to make room for tax cuts.
Yeah, it is going to be something to watch as we move forward. Max, a massive proposed housing development west of McCall is moving forward in the review process, but there's been a lot of public opposition and even some unanswered questions. So we're talking about a final decision, though, months from now in regards to this. But what are the biggest concerns that residents and local officials are raising about what's being called the Red Ridge Village proposal?
Yeah, it's been interesting. This has been kind of simmering on the back burner for over a year now. Let's see, DF Development, the people who own this property, were going to propose it in December 2024, but pulled the application due to widespread backlash. It's now finally in the P&Z pipeline it had its first public hearing, and I would say that the concerns would be best summed up as all of the above. People had problems with just about everything. But there are a few that really stood out. And first were kind of the complaints that the proposal was not compatible with the county's comprehensive plan. really largely due to the location of this proposal. I mean, the plan calls for developments with density like this to be near municipalities, near the infrastructure, near similar density. And sure, the Red Ridge proposal does abut a similar development to the north, but the opponents really zeroed in on the fact that this is a huge development, one that would be the third largest town in Valley County if it's approved as proposed, and it's only accessible by a county road that would need a lot of work to serve that number of people, and it needs to create its own water, its own sewer. It's a big proposal, not where the code calls for it to be, basically.
So, Max, what happens next then in this approval process, and how much influence will public testimony potentially have on the final outcome?
That's right. The whole process is yet to play out, really. So they had their first public hearing on this, which is, you basically get to hear what the proposal is, and then we heard some public testimony. Next up is the P&Z Commission has scheduled a continuation of the public hearing for March 31st. And the P&Z Commission is pretty busy, so they're scheduling these meetings on this project to specifically cover the project. So it will be exactly on that. And there'll be plenty of time for public testimony throughout the process. It's going to be, at every hearing, people show up and they tell you what they think. But a common complaint in Valley County from people who testify at these on a regular basis is that their testimony doesn't seem to affect the outcome. You'll see a proposal for X number of homes, X number of people will show up, tell you that they're opposed, and then it goes through. And they may have a point because officials are also bound by county and state law as to how they can limit development. So people will voice their complaints, and I think the commissions will do what they can to address them.
Sarah, an Idaho lawmaker is proposing a new tweak to state childcare rules that would change how in-home daycares count their own children when they determine staffing ratios. So what problem did Representative Barbie Hart try to solve with this change, and how significant could the impact be for in-home daycare providers?
So yeah, Representative Barbara E. Hart, the sponsor, framed this she kind of downplayed it. She framed this as a cleanup bill to tidy up some loose ends after a larger bill last year that was related to regulating daycares. The gist of both bills, I think, is this, everyone kind of agrees Idaho has a big shortage of daycares. And I think particularly on the right, there's an appetite to reduce the regulation of daycares, especially in-home daycares, to try to increase the number of them and increase access for folks. So last year's bill, which Representative Ehart was also a co-sponsor of, initially proposed totally removing ratios of staff or providers to children in some of these daycares. That was ultimately struck after some pretty emotional pushback, including from the relatives of children who have been injured or killed in daycares where there wasn't enough supervision. This week's bill is much more narrow, so it definitely keeps the ratios, but it says that for an in-home provider, if your own children, whether that's biological, adopted, whatever it may be, your own children don't have to count basically in the ratio as long as they're older than 5.
Okay, so I'm curious if we've heard from childcare advocates or parents reacting to this, because you mentioned last year's debate about loosening ratio requirements, and it was emotional. So any word from advocates or parents about this potential change?
I have not yet heard any pushback. This week it was just an introductory hearing, a print hearing, so this bill has not yet gotten a full committee hearing where we might hear some of those voices come to the fore. We did reach out to Idaho Voices for Children, which said it wasn't taking a stance on this bill. But to your point, I would say stay tuned for a hearing. I am also curious whether we'll see some of that same pretty emotional pushback on this proposed change.
So do we know if there will be a full committee hearing yet? I mean, what happens next?
So the committee this week did vote to introduce the RS, as it's called, and they voted to give it a full hearing. I don't think we have a date set for that yet on when that might come up. So potentially next week, we will see a deeper discussion on this.
All right. So Clark, there's a proposed change to the Idaho Constitution, and it would have reshaped how our state manages its endowment lands. And this is actually stalled in the legislature because there was a tied committee vote that halted the measure's progress, according to your. I'm taking this from your reporting. So,
Yeah.
what were the biggest concerns that led lawmakers to split evenly on this proposal? I mean, which basically just stopped it, at least for now.
Yeah, it would have needed to advance out of the committee and pass the full Idaho House of Representatives and Idaho Senate, and then would have been put on everyone's ballot in Idaho this election day in November. But because it did not advance, it looks like the proposal is likely dead for the year and likely will not go before voters in the November election. But I do think the issue is not going away. It sort of relates to the issue of public lands, which really blew up in a big way in 2025 after the unsuccessful proposal from U.S. Senator Mike Lee of Utah to make millions of acres of public land available, including in Idaho, to be sold off at auction to the highest bidder. This proposal was a little bit different. As you correctly said, Gemma, this related to state endowment lands, many of which were lands that the state of Idaho got from the federal government when Idaho first became a state. What this proposal would have done is it would have removed the requirement in the Idaho Constitution that the state manage lands for the highest maximum financial return. And what the bill's sponsor said, Representative Britt Raybould of Rexburg, she said that would reduce pressure on the state to sell off those state endowment lands. And instead of having the requirement to manage them for maximum financial returns, she instead wanted to have those lands be managed for ongoing revenue generation, like timber harvest, like mining, and like grazing, and with the addition added of access to the public for recreation. Those would have been the changes. The biggest concern that committee members had was sort of this overall anxiety about the idea of amending the Idaho Constitution, saying it's a high bar, it's a step that we can't really undo once we've taken. And so I think it was just some anxiousness and overall about the prospect of amending the Constitution, coupled with the fact that some logging and timber groups from the state of Idaho had come out in opposition to the proposed amendment. But meanwhile, recreation groups supported it and said that access to state lands for the public was an important top issue in Idaho. I don't see the issue going away, even though it does appear this particular proposal has stalled out for the year and may never advance this year, which means it won't go before voters. But I do think management of state endowment lands and management of federal public lands is a huge issue in Idaho that isn't going away. We talked last year about the state selling off 160 acres in eastern Idaho near the Teton Mountain Range, near the town of Driggs, and it was this exact issue of maximizing financial returns that led the state to sell that land. It was an unpopular move with the public when it happened, but because of that requirement in the Constitution, the state moved forward with planning the auction. It's a complicated issue, but access to public lands, both federal and state, is not going away anytime soon in Idaho or in the West. And so we may be having some of these conversations next year and the year after, Gemma.
Yeah, and it's such a huge part of our identity as Idahoans to have that. Max, I've got about 2 minutes left, and I want to quickly get to this story about two Valley County deputies. They survived a terrifying crash. A fully loaded logging truck overturned on their patrol vehicle. They were responding to a fallen tree on an icy road. So, Max, how are the deputies doing? What's come out about what happened? This happened on Warm Lake Road, where a lot of people are familiar with that area.
That's right. It's kind of a cautionary tale to just drive a little slower when it's snowy and icy out there. They were responding to this crash or to this incident, the tree down, and were just getting ready to set up their, warning flags and alert traffic when one of the deputies said, "Hang on," and threw the vehicle in gear and tried to drive away. And then they got hit from behind from a logging truck that kind of drug them about 200 a car down the road that tipped over once it came to a stop. And yeah, sounded pretty terrifying to me.
So are the deputies doing all right? Are they recovering okay?
They were received minor injuries, as it said. But talking to one of the deputies, he said that what they were taken to the hospital as a precaution. Both of them were pretty shaken up, I would assume, but they were physically fine and returned to duty at the regular schedule right after that. Yeah.
All right. But again, as you said, a cautionary tale, right? About just slowing down on those icy roads for sure. So I want to thank all of you so much for your time today and all of the reporting that you do. I would encourage anyone listening, please go and read the reporting from these excellent journalists that we have here in Idaho. A big thank you to Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, Sarah Cutler, reporter with the Idaho Statesman, and Max Silverson, editor of the Star News. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.